The rain came down in gray sheets over the quiet outskirts of the city. The kind of rain that soaked through denim jackets and turned gravel driveways into rivers of mud. Caleb Scott stood at the window of his small wooden house, watching the storm roll over the fields, a mug of lukewarm coffee forgotten in his hand. He had built this house himself, board by board, nail by nail, back when his life still had a shape he recognized. Now it was just him and the quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into a man's bones after everything else had been stripped away. He liked the simplicity of it, the predictability, the way each day looked almost exactly like the one before. He did not know that in a few minutes, a car worth more than his entire property would pull into his driveway and shatter that predictability into 1,000 pieces. The headlights appeared first, twin beams cutting through the downpour like something out of a dream that did not belong in this part of town. A black Rolls-Royce eased to a stop in front of the house, its polished surface streaked with rain, utterly foreign against the backdrop of pine trees and rusted mailboxes. Caleb frowned, setting down his mug, wondering if the driver had taken a wrong turn. He watched as the door opened, and instead of a chauffeur, a woman stepped out into the storm, her heels sinking slightly into the wet earth, her tailored coat already dark with rain. He recognized her immediately, though he had never expected to see her outside of a magazine cover or a Business Channel segment. Eleanor Sterling, the most powerful chief executive in the entire city, was standing in his driveway, drenched to the bone. Looking like she had nowhere else in the world left to go, she walked toward his door without hesitation, her expression unreadable, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. Caleb opened the door before she could knock, more out of instinct than courtesy. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. The wind howled behind her, flinging rain sideways across the porch, and she simply stood there looking at him as though she was measuring something, weighing a decision that had already been made long before she arrived. He noticed the exhaustion behind her eyes, something no amount of makeup or composure could fully hide. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost clinical, completely at odds with the storm raging around her. She said, "I need a husband by Friday." Caleb blinked, certain he had misheard her over the noise of the rain hammering the roof. He asked her to repeat herself, half expecting this to be some elaborate prank orchestrated by people who found his quiet life amusing. But Eleanor did not smile, did not blink, did not show any sign that she considered this a joke in the slightest. She repeated the words slowly, deliberately, each syllable landing like a stone dropped into still water. He stepped back and gestured for her to come inside, if only to escape the storm and figure out what strange mistake had brought a billionaire to his doorstep. She hesitated only a second before crossing the threshold, water dripping onto his worn hardwood floor, her eyes scanning the modest living room with an expression he could not quite place. Once inside, she peeled off her soaked coat and draped it over her arm, refusing the towel he offered with a small shake of her head. She explained that she had not come to the wrong house, that she knew exactly who he was and exactly what she was asking. Her father, Richard Sterling, had passed away 8 months earlier, leaving behind a will with conditions so specific they bordered on cruelty. The final clause stated that Eleanor had to be legally married by a certain date in order to retain full control of Sterling Global, the company her father had spent 40 years building from nothing. If she failed to meet that condition, the entire board of directors would seize control of her shares, stripping her of everything she had worked for since she was old enough to walk through those glass doors. Caleb listened in silence, the rain drumming against the windows, trying to understand why any of this had anything to do with him. She continued, her voice tightening slightly as she reached the heart of the matter. The deadline was Friday, only 4 days away, and every man she had considered so far had wanted something from her that she was not willing to give. She needed someone who would not exploit the arrangement, someone with no interest in her money or her name, someone the tabloids would not immediately expose as a fraud looking for a payday. His name had come up because of an old connection through a mutual acquaintance, someone who had once worked alongside him and still remembered him as a man of quiet, unshakable integrity. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, an old defensiveness rising up before he could stop it. He told her plainly that he was not interested in becoming anyone's convenient solution, no matter how much money or power was at stake. Then he stood, walked to the door, and opened it, silently asking her to leave the way she had come. Eleanor did not move right away. She looked at him for a long moment, rain still dripping from the ends of her hair onto the collar of her blouse, and something behind her composed exterior seemed to crack just slightly. She told him that, if he refused, 50,000 employees would soon belong to people who saw them as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet, numbers to be trimmed and adjusted and discarded whenever a quarterly report demanded it. She said it quietly, without manipulation, simply stating a fact she had clearly turned over in her mind more times than she could count. Caleb stood frozen with his hand still on the door, the wind blowing rain across the threshold, caught between the life he had built for himself and the weight of what she had just placed in front of him. He did not answer her right away. He simply stood there, staring out at the storm, wondering how one conversation could unravel years of carefully constructed peace. Before she left, Eleanor paused at the door, glancing back at the modest living room one last time, taking in the handmade shelves and the stack of worn books beside a reading chair that had clearly seen decades of use. She admitted, almost to herself, that she had expected something entirely different when she pulled up that driveway, something colder and more calculated to match the reputation that preceded him. Instead, she had found a man who valued his solitude enough to refuse an offer most people would have accepted without a second thought. That observation seemed to unsettle her more than anything else that had happened that evening, as though it complicated a plan she had assumed would be simple and transactional. She thanked him for the shelter from the storm, for at least hearing her out instead of turning her away at the threshold, and then she stepped back out into the rain toward her waiting car. Eleanor left that night without an answer, saying only that she would return in 2 days if he changed his mind, and that if he did not, she would understand and never speak of it again. Caleb spent the next day in a strange, restless silence, unable to focus on the small repairs and quiet routines that usually filled his hours. He found himself thinking about the years before this house, before this stillness, when he had been someone entirely different. He had once been among the top engineers in the region, working on infrastructure projects that reshaped entire neighborhoods, respected by people who never once looked down on his ambition. Then his younger brother had died in an accident that could have been prevented with better safety protocols that had been ignored by the very company Caleb worked for at the time. He had walked away from that career entirely, unable to reconcile his grief with an industry that valued profit margins over human lives. And he had not looked back since. When Eleanor returned 2 days later, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, and she arrived without the Rolls-Royce this time, driving a plain sedan instead, as though she understood the effect the luxury car had on him. She sat across from him at his kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she did not drink, and she told him she was not asking for love or affection of any kind. She only needed a partner who could stand beside her in public, someone with enough dignity that no one would question his intentions, someone who understood the value of quiet loyalty. She brought with her a thick folder containing the full text of her father's will, along with financial projections showing what would happen to the company and its employees if Victor Sterling, her cousin, ever gained control. Caleb opened the folder reluctantly, flipping through pages of dense legal language and charts he barely understood at first glance. But as he read further, the picture became devastatingly clear, and he could not pretend otherwise. The documents revealed a systematic plan already drafted in anticipation of Victor's ascension, outlining mass layoffs across 3 major divisions, the sale of manufacturing assets accumulated over 4 decades, and the closure of an entire factory that employed nearly 2,000 people in a small town 2 hours outside the city. Production, according to the projections, would be relocated overseas within 18 months, leaving behind a community that had depended on Sterling Global for generations. Caleb set the folder down slowly, his jaw tightening as he thought of all the families who had no idea their livelihoods hung on a technicality buried in a dead man's will. He thought about his brother, about the countless workers who suffered because someone above them cared more about numbers than people. He looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him with a kind of guarded hope she clearly did not want to show. He asked her, quietly, Why she had not simply chosen someone from within her own social circle, someone accustomed to boardrooms and galas, who would have understood the unspoken rules of her world far better than he ever could. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering, admitting that the men in her circle had always seen her as a prize to be won, a name to attach to their own ambitions, a merger disguised as a marriage. She said she had grown tired of being evaluated for what she could offer, rather than who she actually was underneath the title on her office door. Something about the way she said it, quiet and unguarded, made Caleb realize that the woman sitting across his kitchen table was far lonelier than any headline had ever suggested. He thought of his brother again, of how quickly the world moved on from people it no longer found useful, and he found himself understanding her situation more than he wanted to admit. After a long silence, he finally spoke, telling her that he would agree to her proposal, but only under conditions of his own. He laid out his terms carefully, insisting there would be no manufactured affection performed for cameras or curious onlookers, no forced intimacy neither of them actually felt. He demanded complete honesty between them at all times, regardless of how uncomfortable certain truths might become as the arrangement continued. He made clear that once the specified period ended and her position was secure, they would file for divorce without complication or resentment on either side. Above all, he insisted on mutual respect, an understanding that, despite the strange circumstances binding them together, neither would ever treat the other as beneath consideration. Eleanor listened to each condition without interrupting, nodding slowly, something like relief passing behind her tired eyes. When he finished, she extended her hand across the table, and he shook it, sealing an agreement that neither of them yet understood would change everything they thought they knew about themselves. That night, after Eleanor departed, Caleb sat alone at his kitchen table for a long while, staring at the folder she had left behind for him to review one final time. He thought of the small town 2 hours outside the city, the one that would lose its only factory if Victor ever gained control, and he wondered how many families there had any idea their futures depended on a stranger's decision made in a quiet kitchen during a rainstorm. He thought, too, of his brother, the meetings where safety concerns had been dismissed in favor of faster deadlines and larger margins, and how helpless he had felt watching it happen from the inside. This arrangement, strange and unprecedented as it was, offered him something he had not expected to feel again, a sense that his choices might actually matter to people who would never know his name. He closed the folder, turned off the kitchen light, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond the quiet borders of his small wooden house. The marriage license was filed on a Wednesday morning, quiet and unremarkable in the eyes of the clerk who processed it, unaware of the storm about to break loose. Within hours, the news had already begun circulating through financial channels and gossip columns alike, spreading faster than either of them anticipated. Reporters descended on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, shouting questions neither Caleb nor Eleanor were prepared to answer. Sterling Global's stock price dipped sharply within the first hour of trading. Investors uncertain what the sudden marriage meant for the company's leadership and direction. Victor Sterling, watching from his office on the 40th floor, felt a fury rise in him that he struggled to contain in front of his assistant. He had been so certain the deadline would pass unmet, so confident that Eleanor's stubborn independence would cost her everything, that the news landed like a physical blow. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting by that evening, their faces tight with suspicion as they debated the legitimacy of the sudden union. Several members questioned whether this marriage had been arranged purely as a legal maneuver, a loophole designed to circumvent the very conditions Richard Sterling had so carefully constructed. Headlines splashed across every major outlet within days, painting Eleanor as a secretive executive who had wed a complete unknown in order to protect her fortune. One particularly biting article referred to Caleb only as the mystery husband, a phrase that followed him into every room he entered for weeks afterward. When Caleb first stepped into the towering glass headquarters of Sterling Global, he felt every eye in the lobby turned toward him, whispers rippling through the crowd like static electricity. He kept his shoulders straight and his expression calm, though inside he felt entirely out of place among the marble floors and gleaming chandeliers. His first walk through the executive boardroom was perhaps the most humiliating experience of the entire ordeal, as members of the financial elite openly scrutinized him from head to toe. One board member, a sharp-tongued woman named Patricia Halloway, made no effort to hide her contempt as she looked him over. She told him bluntly that he was nothing more than a husband on paper, a convenient prop, dressed up to satisfy legal formalities, and nothing else. The room fell silent, waiting to see how he would respond to such a direct insult delivered in front of nearly a dozen powerful executives. Caleb only smiled, unbothered by her words, and told her that paper or not, he intended to understand every single decision this company made from that point forward. His calm confidence unsettled several people in that room far more than an angry outburst ever could have. And Eleanor, seated at the head of the table, felt something unfamiliar stir inside her chest as she watched him hold his ground. In the weeks that followed, Caleb made a habit of arriving early to the office, long before the elevators filled with executives clutching coffee cups and phones, so that he could study the company's operations without an audience watching his every move. He read through annual reports dating back over a decade, familiarizing himself with divisions he had never heard of, learning the language of quarterly earnings and depreciation schedules with the same discipline he had once applied to structural engineering. Some employees regarded him with open suspicion, certain he had married his way into a position of influence he had done nothing to earn. Others, particularly those working in the lower floors of the building where decisions rarely reached them, began to notice something different about the way he treated people. He remembered names, asked about families, and never once spoke down to anyone regardless of their title or salary. Slowly, a quiet respect began to form among the staff. One built not on his connection to Eleanor, but on the character he displayed when he assumed no one of importance was watching. Behind the steel exterior that made Eleanor Sterling one of the most feared executives in the industry, there existed a woman almost no one had ever truly seen. During daylight hours, she moved through her responsibilities with icy precision, her decisions swift and unyielding, her tone leaving no room for argument or hesitation. Employees whispered about her legendary composure, how she could dismantle a failing proposal in under 2 minutes without raising her voice even slightly. But behind the closed doors of the penthouse, she rarely left except for work. Eleanor often found herself awake until 2 in the morning, staring at reports she had already memorized hours earlier. She ate dinner alone most nights, the vast dining table far too large for a single-place setting, the silence pressing in around her like a physical weight. In quiet, unguarded moments, she thought constantly of her father, replaying old conversations, wondering if she had ever truly earned his approval or simply inherited his obligations. Caleb began to notice these fractures almost immediately, the small signs that betrayed the exhaustion hiding beneath her polished exterior. He started arriving earlier than necessary, organizing her overflowing schedule into something more manageable, quietly canceling meetings that served no real purpose beyond feeding someone's ego. He gently pushed back when she tried to work through the night, reminding her that even the sharpest mind eventually dulled without proper rest. He identified inefficient processes within her office that had gone unquestioned for years, simply because no one dared challenge her judgment. And he suggested corrections with a tact that surprised even himself. Slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, their conversations extended beyond business necessities into something resembling genuine curiosity about one another. Eleanor found herself laughing at small, unexpected moments, a sound so rare among her staff that her assistant once nearly dropped an entire tray of coffee in shock. One evening, arriving later than usual to bring her dinner she suspected she had forgotten to order, Caleb found Eleanor asleep at her desk, her head resting against a stack of unread files, a pen still loosely held in her fingers. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, unwilling to disturb her, studying the way exhaustion had softened features that seemed permanently sharpened during business hours. He eventually woke her gently, guiding her toward the small couch in the corner of her office, rather than allowing her to drive home in that state, and he sat with her until she finally admitted how frightened she truly was of losing everything her father had built. She confessed that she had never once been allowed to simply rest, that even as a child she had been groomed for this exact position, every accomplishment measured against some invisible standard she could never quite reach. Caleb listened without offering easy reassurances, understanding instinctively that she needed someone to simply witness her exhaustion rather than try to fix it immediately. It was, in many ways, the first night that their arrangement began to feel like something entirely different from the contract they had both signed. Weeks into the arrangement, subtle signs of something amiss began surfacing within several of Sterling Global's ongoing infrastructure projects. Caleb, drawing on his old engineering background, noticed inconsistencies in budget reports that seemed deliberately obscured beneath layers of unnecessary complexity. Certain contracts listed suppliers that, upon closer inspection, appeared to be shell companies with no verifiable history or physical location. Daniel Brooks, the chief financial officer, found himself under quiet suspicion, his name appearing repeatedly beside transactions that made little logical sense. Victor, ever the opportunist, began quietly steering blame toward Daniel in private conversations with select board members, planting seeds of doubt long before anyone had gathered concrete evidence. Caleb, however, refused to accept the easy narrative being constructed around him, choosing instead to investigate the matter on his own time, away from prying eyes. His research led him through weeks of late nights, poring over financial statements, cross-referencing supplier registrations with public records that told a very different story. Piece by piece, the trail led not to Daniel Brooks, but directly back to Victor himself, whose fingerprints were carefully hidden beneath layers of shell corporations and falsified documentation. Victor's plan, as Caleb slowly uncovered, was to deliberately weaken the company from within, inflating costs and manufacturing crises that would tank investor confidence over time. By artificially depressing the stock price through manufactured scandal and internal sabotage, he intended to buy back controlling shares at a fraction of their true value, once shareholders panicked and sold. It was a patient, methodical scheme, one that had likely been in motion long before Richard Sterling's death had even been announced to the public. Caleb realized that the battle ahead was no longer just about honoring a marriage of convenience, but about protecting an entire company from a betrayal orchestrated by someone within its own family. He spent several nights compiling everything he had discovered into a single, organized record, cross-referencing dates and signatures until the pattern of deception became undeniable even to an untrained eye. He was careful not to alert Victor to his suspicions, understanding that a man capable of this level of calculated deceit would not hesitate to destroy evidence the moment he sensed exposure. Caleb reached out quietly to a former colleague from his engineering days, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who now worked in corporate forensics, asking for guidance on how to verify the authenticity of certain financial documents without raising alarm. Grace agreed to help discreetly, reviewing scanned copies of the suspicious contracts and confirming what Caleb had already begun to suspect on his own. Together, they traced the shell companies back through several layers of registration, paperwork, eventually finding a signature that matched Victor's handwriting on an early founding document neither of them had expected to uncover. It was the kind of proof that could not easily be dismissed or explained away. And Caleb understood that he now carried the weight of information capable of determining the fate of an entire corporation. The media crisis erupted without warning one Tuesday morning, when an anonymous source leaked documents suggesting the marriage itself had been fraudulently arranged to circumvent legal will requirements. Rumors spread rapidly, alleging that Eleanor had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to deceive both the courts and her father's estate, throwing her entire legitimacy into question. Accusations of governance violations followed close behind, painting the picture of a company on the verge of collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Shareholders, already nervous from weeks of instability, began selling off their positions in droves, sending the stock into a steep and alarming decline. Eleanor, for the first time in years, appeared visibly shaken during an internal meeting, her usual composure fractured by the sheer speed at which everything seemed to be unraveling around her. It was Caleb who stepped forward, insisting they hold a press conference before the narrative slipped entirely out of their control. Standing before a room full of skeptical journalists, Caleb spoke with a clarity and precision that surprised even the seasoned reporters seated in the front rows. He methodically dismantled each accusation, presenting logical counterpoints backed by verifiable timelines and documentation that could not easily be disputed. He addressed the fraud allegations directly, explaining the legal validity of the marriage, while carefully avoiding any mention of the ongoing investigation into Victor's activities. For the first time since his name had entered public conversation, journalists began referring to him not as the mystery husband, but as someone worth taking seriously in his own right. Analysts who had once dismissed him as an irrelevant footnote in Eleanor's story now openly praised his composure and command of complicated financial detail. Eleanor watched him from the side of the room, and something shifted behind her eyes, an expression of quiet, unmistakable respect that had not been there before. Afterward, in the quiet of the car ride back to the office, Eleanor turned to him and admitted that she had underestimated exactly how capable he was beneath the humility he wore so easily. She told him that most of the men who had once tried to court her would have used a moment like that press conference to elevate themselves at her expense, drawing attention to their own brilliance, rather than protecting what they had built together. Caleb only shrugged, saying that he had simply told the truth as clearly as he understood it, and that credit mattered far less to him than making certain the company survived intact. Eleanor studied him for a long moment in the dim light of the car, as though seeing him fully for the first time since that rainy night on his porch. She realized, with a quiet and unsettling clarity, that she had begun to rely on his presence in ways that extended well beyond the terms they had originally negotiated. It was a realization she chose not to speak aloud, though it lingered with her long after they arrived back at the towering glass building that had become, in some strange way, a shared home for them both. As the weeks progressed, business obligations required them to travel together more frequently, blurring the careful boundaries they had established at the very beginning of their arrangement. They shared dinners in unfamiliar cities, sat side by side during long car rides, through storms that reminded Caleb of the night they first met, and worked through countless nights preparing for high-stakes negotiations. During one particularly quiet evening, Eleanor confided that she had never truly allowed herself to fall in love with anyone. Always too consumed by the relentless demands of running her father's empire, she admitted that ambition had been both her greatest strength and the loneliest burden she had ever carried, a truth she had never spoken aloud to another living person. Caleb, in turn, shared the full story of his brother's death, the anger he had carried for years toward an industry that valued profit over human safety. Slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, they began healing wounds neither had realized still bled beneath the surface. Neither spoke the word love, not yet, but something in the way they looked at each other had unmistakably changed. During one trip to a coastal city for a series of investor meetings, a sudden thunderstorm delayed their flight home, stranding them together in an airport lounge for nearly 6 hours. Rather than growing impatient, they found themselves talking more freely than they ever had before, drifting from business strategy into childhood memories neither had planned on sharing. Eleanor described summers spent trailing after her father through factory floors, memorizing machine names before she had even learned to read properly, desperate for his approval in ways she had never fully outgrown. Caleb spoke of teaching his brother to fix an old truck engine in their parents' garage, the two of them covered in grease, laughing over mistakes that seemed enormous at the time and utterly trivial in hindsight. At one point, Eleanor reached over and brushed a smudge of ink from his sleeve where a pen had leaked earlier that day, her fingers lingering just a moment longer than the gesture required. Neither commented on it, but both noticed, and the silence that followed felt heavier and warmer than any conversation that had come before it. The annual shareholder meeting arrived with tension thick enough to feel in the air of the grand auditorium, every seat filled with investors anxious for answers. Victor rose first, presenting a folder of what he claimed was irrefutable evidence proving the marriage had been staged purely for financial gain. Lawyers on both sides argued fiercely, their voices rising over one another as the crowd murmured uneasily in their seats. Amelia Reyes, Eleanor's longtime legal counsel, fought back point by point, refusing to yield ground even as Victor's accusations grew increasingly aggressive and personal. Just as the argument threatened to spiral entirely out of control, Caleb walked calmly down the center aisle, carrying a slim folder that seemed almost insignificant compared to the chaos surrounding him. He approached the podium and asked for the room's attention, his voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes now fixed entirely upon him. He presented the evidence he had gathered over the previous weeks, laying out incriminating emails, falsified contracts, and financial records that traced every fraudulent transaction directly back to Victor's personal accounts. The room fell into stunned silence as document after document appeared on the projection screen, each one dismantling Victor's carefully constructed narrative piece by piece. Victor's composure cracked visibly, his objections growing more desperate and disjointed, as the evidence mounted against him beyond any reasonable denial. Financial regulators, alerted beforehand by Amelia through proper legal channels, entered the auditorium just as the presentation concluded, their presence confirming the seriousness of the charges now laid bare. The board called for an immediate vote, and one by one, members raised their hands in support of Eleanor's continued leadership over Sterling Global. When the final count was announced, the entire auditorium rose to its feet in thunderous applause, a moment of vindication neither Eleanor nor Caleb had expected to feel so deeply. Victor was escorted from the building by security under the watchful eyes of the very shareholders who had once trusted him without question, his composure finally shattering, as reporters shouted questions he no longer had the power to ignore. Patricia Halloway, who had once dismissed Caleb so openly in that same boardroom, approached him afterward and offered a quiet, sincere apology for misjudging him so completely. She admitted that she had rarely seen anyone defend a company with such precision and conviction, especially someone with no formal obligation to do so beyond a marriage most had assumed was hollow. Amelia Reyes, exhausted but triumphant, gathered her files and told Eleanor privately that she had never seen a legal battle turn so decisively in their favor within a single afternoon. Eleanor barely heard any of it, her attention fixed entirely on Caleb across the room, watching him accept quiet congratulations with the same humility he had carried since the very first night they met. For the first time since her father's passing, she felt the full weight finally lift from her shoulders, replaced by something warmer and far less familiar. In the days that followed, the storm finally began to settle, leaving behind a quiet that felt almost foreign after months of relentless chaos. With Victor's scheme fully exposed and legal proceedings already underway against him, Eleanor's position within the company stood more secure than it had ever been before. Caleb began quietly preparing to leave, believing the arrangement had run its natural course and that it was time to return the life they had built back to something resembling normalcy. He gathered his belongings from the penthouse where he had stayed during the marriage, folding shirts he had never truly grown accustomed to wearing among such luxury. On the kitchen counter, he left behind his set of keys to the estate, along with the wedding ring Eleanor had given him during their brief courthouse ceremony. Beside them, he placed a short letter thanking her for trusting him, for allowing him to matter in a world that had once made him feel entirely invisible. In the letter, he wrote that he had entered their arrangement, expecting nothing more than an exchange of favors, a temporary role he would play until the papers could be quietly dissolved. He admitted that somewhere between the late nights reviewing budgets and the quiet dinners neither of them had planned to share, the arrangement had stopped feeling like an obligation at all. He told her that watching her fight for her father's legacy had reminded him what it felt like to care about something larger than his own carefully guarded solitude. He wished her well, sincerely, and said he hoped she would finally allow herself the rest she had denied herself for so many years. He signed it simply with his name, no closing sentiment beyond that, as though he could not bring himself to write anything more without breaking the composure he had held together for months. Eleanor found the letter later that evening, standing alone in the kitchen where they had shared so many quiet conversations over the preceding months. She read his words twice, then a third time, trying to convince herself that this outcome had always been the plan, that nothing about this ending should surprise or unsettle her in the slightest. She told herself repeatedly that this had only ever been a legal arrangement, a temporary solution to a temporary problem now fully resolved. Yet as she stood there holding the ring in her palm, she could not shake the growing hollowness spreading through her chest with every passing minute. Caleb, meanwhile, drove home through streets slick with the beginnings of another storm, the sky darkening exactly as it had the night everything between them first began. The rain started just as he turned onto the familiar road leading toward his small wooden house, the same stretch of highway where fate had first brought them together. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to convince himself that returning to his old life would feel like relief rather than loss, that the quiet he had once cherished would welcome him back the same way it always had. But the silence in the car felt different now, heavier somehow, filled with the absence of a voice that had become far more familiar to him than he was prepared to admit. He thought of the letter he had left behind, wondering if she would even read it before her assistant discarded it among the countless documents that crossed her desk each day. He told himself it did not matter, that he had done what he came to do, and that the company and its employees were finally safe from the threat that had loomed over them for months. Yet as his house came into view through the rain-streaked windshield, he felt none of the relief he had expected, only a hollow ache settling steadily into his chest. Eleanor sat motionless at her kitchen table for nearly an hour before finally standing, grabbing her car keys with a sudden, unshakable urgency she did not fully understand. She drove through the rain without an umbrella, without her usual careful composure, following the same route Caleb had taken only minutes before her. The storm intensified as she drove, headlights barely cutting through sheets of rain, pounding against her windshield with relentless force. She caught up to him just before he reached his driveway, flashing her lights until he pulled over onto the muddy shoulder of the road. Stepping out of her car into the downpour, she looked nothing like the powerful executive who commanded boardrooms and silenced skeptics with a single sentence. For the first time since either of them had known her, Eleanor Sterling stood before him simply as a woman, stripped entirely of titles, stock prices, and inherited obligations. Tears mixed freely with the rain streaming down her face as she walked toward him, her carefully maintained composure finally giving way entirely. She told him that she no longer needed a husband to secure her father's company, that the legal requirement no longer held any weight over the words she was about to say. Caleb stood silently, rain soaking through his jacket, waiting for her to finish whatever it was she had driven through a storm to tell him. She continued, her voice breaking slightly, saying that what she needed now was not a solution to a legal problem, but simply him, Caleb Scott, exactly as he was. She said he was the one who had taught her what it truly felt like to be trusted without condition, without agenda, without expectation of anything in return. She added that he had shown her, for the very first time in her life, that she did not have to fight every single battle entirely alone. Caleb closed the distance between them slowly, rain dripping from his hair onto her upturned face, his expression softening into something she had never seen from him before. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the storm raged around them. Indifferent to the two figures standing in the middle of an empty road, he told her that this time, his answer was different, that he would choose to become her husband not because of any contract or clause buried in a dying man's will. He said he wanted this because of everything they had built together in the months since that first strange, impossible night in the rain. He told her that he had spent years believing he had nothing left to offer anyone, that grief had hollowed him out until he was content simply to disappear into the quiet corners of his own life. Meeting her, he said, had reminded him what it felt like to matter to someone beyond the narrow walls he had built around himself, to be needed for something more than his silence. He admitted that leaving her penthouse that morning had been one of the hardest things he had done since the day he walked away from his old career, and that he had spent the entire drive home trying to convince himself it was the right decision. Standing here now, soaked through and holding her in the middle of an empty road, he knew with absolute certainty that it had not been the right decision at all. Eleanor buried her face against his shoulder, finally allowing herself to feel something she had denied for years. Something that had nothing to do with control, or legacy, or fear. In that moment, standing soaked and unguarded on a forgotten stretch of road, both of them understood that whatever came next would be chosen freely, not forced by circumstance. They stood there long after the rain had soaked through every layer of clothing they wore, neither willing to be the first to let go, as though releasing one another even slightly might undo everything they had just admitted aloud. Eventually, Eleanor laughed softly through her tears, telling him that of all the places she imagined finally speaking her heart, She had never once pictured herself doing it on the side of a muddy road in a rainstorm. Caleb smiled and reminded her that their entire story had begun the exact same way, with rain and mud, and a proposal neither of them had expected to accept. He suggested, only half joking, that perhaps they were simply the kind of people who needed a storm to finally tell each other the truth. Eleanor took his hand, and together they walked back toward their cars, no longer strangers bound by a dying man's will, but two people who had somehow found their way to each other despite every reason not to. Months later, they held a proper wedding, surrounded by family, close friends, and the employees who had come to respect them both. Through everything they had endured together, the small factory town that had once faced closure under Victor's plans now thrived under new investment. Its workers, finally treated as valued contributors rather than expendable expenses. Caleb took on a role as a strategic advisor within Sterling Global, though he continued living with the same quiet simplicity that had first drawn Eleanor to trust him above anyone else. Eleanor restructured much of the company's internal culture, prioritizing the well-being of her employees alongside the profits her father had always emphasized above all else. Victor and those who conspired alongside him faced the full consequences of their actions under the law, their carefully built reputations dismantled by the very greed that had driven them. And on a quiet afternoon many months after their first meeting, Caleb and Eleanor walked together beneath a gentle rain along the same road, where everything between them had first begun, no longer bound by any contract, but by a choice they had both finally made for themselves.